Never let them control your emotions. Take back your power. Carl Jung's Stoic Brath explores how hidden patterns, projections, and external validation shape your emotional state, and how to reclaim control from within. Learn to pause, observe, and break free from automatic reactions using powerful Stoic and Jungian insights. Build true inner stability, clarity, and self-mastery in everyday life. Subscribe now to stay ahead with deeper insights and practical tools for mastering your mind. On Stoicism Breath, let's begin with a truth most people feel but rarely know how to name. Not every wound comes from something big. Sometimes it begins with something almost invisible. A slight change in someone's tone. A message that never gets answered. A look that feels just a little colder than before. And in that tiny moment, something inside you shifts. Not violently. Not dramatically. Just enough to feel your attention tighten. Just enough for your mind to start circling the moment like it means more than it should. You tell yourself it's nothing. You try to move on. But the mind does not move on so easily. It replays the scene, searches for meaning, fills in the blanks, and before you realize it, your mood has already started adjusting itself around something that may not have even been intentional in the first place. And that is where the real problem begins, not in what happened, but in how quickly your inner state gets handed over to something outside of you. Not because you consciously chose to give your power away. Not because you wanted to be affected, but because the reaction felt automatic, familiar, almost impossible to stop. And if you slowed down long enough to really look at it, you'll notice something even more important. This is not just one moment. It is a pattern. The same emotional shift appears again and again, only wearing different faces. Different people. Different situations. Same internal movement. Same uncertainty. Same silent loss of balance. And over time, almost without your noticing, that pattern starts shaping the way you feel about yourself based on things that were never fully yours to control in the first place. At first, the explanation seems simple. You tell yourself maybe you just care too much. Maybe you need thicker skin. Maybe confidence is the missing piece. And that idea feels comforting for a moment, because it makes the problem sound small, fixable, manageable. Just toughen up. Stop overthinking. Stop taking things personally. But if the answer were really that simple, it would have worked by now. You've already tried not caring. You've already tried acting detached. You've already replayed the moment in your head, trying to convince yourself it wasn't a big deal. And yet the next time it happens, the reaction arrives before logic has a chance to speak. Fast. Automatic. Familiar. That is what most people miss. If something keeps happening despite all your efforts to control it, then it is not superficial. It is structural. It is built into the way you interpret what happens around you. Your emotional responses are not random. They follow patterns. And patterns like that do not come from nowhere. They come from systems you have been running for years, often without realizing it. The moment your emotional state rises or falls depending on someone else's behavior, something important is being revealed. Your center is not where you think it is. It is not fully inside you. It has been placed outside of you, in reactions, in approval, in attention, in how someone responds, in what is said, in what is left unsaid. And because your center is living in things that constantly move, you feel unstable. One moment grounded, the next uncertain. Not because something essential inside you truly changed, but because something outside of you did. That is why it feels so exhausting. You are trying to build inner peace on shifting ground. And if you stand on shifting ground long enough, eventually it starts to feel normal. You begin to assume this is just how life is, that being affected this way is natural, that everyone must be quietly thrown around by the moods, words, and reactions of other people. But what is actually happening is more serious than simple emotional sensitivity. It is dependency. A quiet one. A hidden one. The kind that does not announce itself loudly, but reveals itself in how easily your inner state can be changed by things you do not control. And that distinction matters, because there is a difference between feeling something and being ruled by it. Feeling is human. Feeling moves through you. But being controlled by what you feel begins to shape how you think, how you act, and how you see yourself. When that control is coming from something outside of you, it creates a kind of instability that follows you everywhere. It does not matter what city you live in, who you spend time with, or how much you tell yourself you've changed. The same pattern keeps showing up in new forms. And this is where strength is so often misunderstood. Many people think strength means shutting down, becoming cold, acting indifferent, pretending nothing matters. But suppression is not strength. Numbness is not freedom. Pushing the reaction down does not remove it. It only buries it. And what gets buried does not disappear. It builds pressure. It waits. And sooner or later, it comes back with even more force. So the goal is not to feel less. The goal is to understand what your feelings are attached to. Because the real issue is not that you care deeply. The real issue is that your emotional life has become tied to things you cannot control. And once your feelings are attached to unstable things, those things begin to own more power over you than they ever should have had. That is why two people can go through the exact same situation and walk away completely differently. One person lets it pass like wine through an open window. The other carries it for hours, maybe days. The difference is not always the event itself. The difference is the interpretation. One person is anchored internally. The other is anchored externally. And that difference changes everything. When you are anchored internally, the outside world can still affect you, but it does not define you. A difficult moment remains a moment. It does not become a verdict about your worth. A cold response remains a cold response. It does not become proof that something is wrong with you. But when you are anchored externally, every small shift starts to feel loaded. Every silence becomes a message. Every look becomes a conclusion. Every delay becomes a story. And the mind, desperate for certainty, starts creating meaning where there may be none. That is how power gets transferred. Not in one dramatic collapse, but in 1,000 quiet interpretations. So this is where the real work begins. Not by trying to become harder. Not by pretending you do not care. But by becoming honest enough to ask, what exactly is my emotional state attached to? What am I giving authority to? What outside of me has been allowed to decide how I feel about myself? Because once you can see that clearly, you are no longer completely trapped inside the reaction. You are beginning to understand it. And understanding is where power starts to return. That is the first shift. The first reclaiming. The first real sign of strength. Not the strength of becoming emotionless, but the strength of no longer letting everything outside you decide what happens within you. And once that shift begins, even slightly, your entire life starts to change. On Stoicism Breath, there is a simple idea, almost too simple, that cuts straight through all of this confusion, and yet it changes everything once you truly see it. It goes like this. If something outside of you causes distress, the pain is not coming from the event itself, but from your judgment about it. At first, that sounds like philosophy. Something abstract. Something distant. But if you slow down and look at your own experience, you'll realize it's not theory at all. It's a direct description of how your mind actually works. Think about it. The moment something happens, a delayed reply, a short message, a subtle shift in someone's tone, your mind doesn't just observe it. It interprets it. Instantly. Automatically. Quietly. And that interpretation becomes your emotional reality. Not the event itself, but what you think it means. That is the moment everything changes. Because if your reaction is shaped by interpretation, then your instability is not coming from the world. It's coming from the relationship you have with what happens. And that realization is uncomfortable. It takes away the easy option of blaming other people. It removes the idea that peace will come when others behave differently. But at the same time, it gives you something far more valuable. It shows you where your real control actually is. Not in changing the outside world, which is impossible, but in understanding what's happening inside your own mind. This is where the shift truly begins. Not by trying to control every situation, every person, every outcome that will only exhaust you, but by becoming aware of how quickly your mind assigns meaning. How it takes something small and turns it into something personal. How it fills in gaps with assumptions that feel real, even when they are built on incomplete information. A late response becomes disinterest. A short message becomes rejection. A quiet moment becomes judgment. And before you even have time to question it, your emotional state has already followed that story. But what if that story isn't true? What if it's just familiar? Instead of following these interpretations blindly, you begin to do something different. Not aggressively, not perfectly, just enough to interrupt the automatic pattern. You begin to question them. You begin to pause. And in that pause, something powerful happens. You create space. Not physical space, but psychological space. A gap between what happened and how you react to it. And in that gap, you are no longer completely consumed by the reaction. You are also observing it. You are watching it form, watching it rise, watching it try to take control. And that observation weakens its grip. At first, that space is small, almost invisible. You might only catch it after the reaction has already started. But over time, something begins to change. That gap gets wider. You start noticing patterns earlier. You begin to recognize when your mood is being pulled by something external. And instead of being carried away by it, you pause, even if just for a second. And that second matters. Because in that moment, you have a choice. Not a perfect one. Not always a strong one. But a real one. You can either follow the reaction, let it define your state, let it shape your thoughts, or you can step back. And every time you step back, even slightly, you take something back that you didn't even realize you were giving away. Your attention, your energy, your sense of self. Not all at once, but piece by piece. And this is how real stability is built. Not by controlling the world around you, but by understanding how you relate to it. By recognizing that your mind is constantly interpreting, constantly assigning meaning, constantly turning moments into conclusions, and learning not to believe every interpretation immediately. If this way of seeing things feels different, don't rush past it. Stay with it. Let it challenge the way you've been understanding your own reactions. Because what you're discovering here is not just a mindset shift, it's a structural change in how you experience life. The Stoics understood something that still feels uncomfortable when you really sit with it. not because it's complicated, but because it's simple in a way that leaves no room for excuses. There are things that belong to you, and things that do not. Your thoughts, your choices, your interpretations, those are yours. But how other people act, how they respond, how they feel about you, that exists completely outside of your control. And yet, if you pay attention to your daily life, you'll notice how often that line gets blurred. You hear someone's tone and treat it as a reflection of your worth. You see someone's silence and treat it as a message about you. You experience a moment, a temporary, external event, and turn it into a fixed internal truth. And the most dangerous part? It doesn't feel strange. It feels natural, automatic, almost unavoidable. The mind moves so fast that meaning is assigned before awareness even has a chance to step in. That is why it's so easy to miss. But once you start noticing it, everything begins to shift. You begin to see that the real problem is not just what is happening around you. It's how quickly you convert external events into internal conclusions. Conclusions that feel solid, personal, real, even when they are based on assumptions. And underneath all of this, there is a quiet belief, one that most people never question. The belief that other people's reactions define your value, that their approval confirms something about you, and their indifference exposes something lacking. But the moment you rely on something unstable to define something that should be stable, you create a system that can never truly hold. Because people are not consistent. Their moods change. Their attention shifts. Their priorities move. And none of that is truly about you, even though it often feels like it is. This is the line you must learn to see. And once you see it clearly, you stop stepping outside of what is yours to control. You stop trying to manage reactions that were never yours to begin with. You stop adjusting yourself to stabilize something that was never stable. And slowly, something inside you begins to return. Not all at once, but enough to feel it. A sense of grounding that doesn't depend on someone else's response. A sense of clarity that isn't shaken by every small shift. A sense of self that begins to stand on something real, something internal. And that is where true freedom starts. On Stoicism Breath, there's a quiet belief that shapes more of your life than you realize. A belief so subtle it feels like truth. It's the idea that other people's reactions are reliable indicators of your value. That if someone approves of you, it confirms something real, and if they don't, it reveals something missing. It feels logical. It feels human. But if you look closely, it's also the root of your instability. Because the moment you allow something unstable to define something that should be stable, you create a system that can never hold. Other people are not consistent. Their moods shift. Their attention moves. Their priorities change. And most of the time, those changes have nothing to do with you, even though your mind tries to make it personal. Think about how often this happens. Someone is distracted, and your mind translates it into rejection. Someone is quiet, and suddenly it feels like disapproval. Someone doesn't respond the way you expected, and your internal state begins to shift. Not because anything concrete happened, but because your interpretation filled in the gaps. And this is where the Stoic idea becomes more than philosophy. It becomes a line, a boundary you either respect or ignore. There are things that belong to you, and there are things that do not. Your thoughts, your choices, your interpretations, those are yours. But how other people respond, how they feel, how they perceive you, that is not. Yet if you pay attention to your daily reactions, you'll notice how often you step outside of that boundary. You try to predict how others will respond. You adjust your behavior to influence how they see you. You monitor their reactions to stabilize how you feel. And slowly, without even realizing it, you build a system where your internal balance depends on something external staying consistent. But the external world was never designed to be consistent. That's why the instability keeps coming back. Not because you're doing something wrong in the moment, but because the structure itself is unstable. You've tied your sense of self to variables that change constantly. And when those variables shift, even slightly, your internal state shifts with them. At first, it's subtle. A small drop in your mood. A quiet sense of unease. A feeling you can't quite explain. But over time, those small shifts begin to stack. And eventually, it starts to feel like unpredictability. Like you're fine one moment, and unsettled the next, without a clear reason why. This is why detachment is so often misunderstood. People think it means not caring, ignoring others, becoming distant. But real detachment is not about disconnecting from life. It's about putting things in their proper place. It's about recognizing what belongs to you and what doesn't, and refusing to mix the two. Because the moment you stop treating external reactions as internal truths, something begins to stabilize. Not instantly, not perfectly, but gradually. You begin to notice something you've never really seen before, the gap between what happens and what you make it mean. You start to see how quickly your mind creates interpretations that feel real, even when they aren't necessarily accurate. And instead of immediately believing those interpretations, you begin to pause. Just briefly. But that pause changes everything. Because now, the reaction is no longer automatic. It's observed. And once something is observed, it can be questioned. Not suppressed. Not denied. But examined. You begin to ask, is this meaning actually true, or is it just familiar? Is this reaction based on reality, or is it coming from a pattern I've repeated so many times it feels like truth? And in asking those questions, something starts to shift. Not in the external world, people will still be unpredictable. Situations will still change. But internally, the dependency begins to loosen. You're no longer handing over authority automatically. You're no longer treating every external signal as something that defines you. You begin to reclaim that boundary. Slowly, consistently. And as that boundary becomes clearer, something else becomes clearer too, your sense of stability. Not because nothing affects you anymore, but because what affects you no longer controls you in the same way. The reaction still exists, but it doesn't take over. It doesn't define the entire moment. It moves through you instead of settling inside you. And that is the difference between understanding this idea and living it. One is intellectual. The other is practiced. Because the more you practice this pause, this observation, this questioning, the more you realize something powerful. Stability was never about controlling the world around you. It was always about understanding what was never yours to control in the first place, and finally letting it go. On Stoicism Breath, once you begin to step back from your reactions, even slightly, you start to notice something most people never see. There is a pattern hidden inside the way you respond to the world. But it doesn't reveal itself when you're rushing, reacting, or trying to control everything. It only becomes visible when you slow down enough to observe. Because not everything affects you equally. Some comments pass through your mind without leaving a trace. You hear them, and they're gone. But others stay. They echo. They replay in your thoughts long after the moment has ended. One person's opinion feels light, almost irrelevant. Another's feels heavy, almost defining. And if you pause and really examine that difference, you'll realize something surprising. It's not random. It follows a pattern. A logic that isn't immediately obvious, but it's there, quietly shaping what stays and what fades, what disturbs you and what doesn't. The reaction itself becomes the clue. Not just the fact that you reacted, but how strongly you reacted, how long it lasted, how much space it took up in your mind afterward. These details matter, because they reveal something deeper than the situation itself. At first, it's easy to assume the intensity comes from what happened, that something about the situation was objectively more important. But if you compare different moments honestly, that explanation starts to fall apart. The same type of comment can feel harmless in one situation and deeply unsettling in another. The same behavior can be ignored when it comes from one person and felt intensely when it comes from someone else. So the source of the reaction cannot be only external. It must be connected to something internal. Something that existed before the moment even happened. And this is where things start to become more revealing. Because when a reaction feels stronger than the situation seems to justify, it usually means something deeper has been touched. Not created, but activated. Something already sensitive. Something unresolved. Something you haven't fully understood or accepted within yourself. Think about that for a moment. Have you ever noticed how certain people seem to affect you more than others, even when they say or do the same things? It's not always about their authority, their status, or even their intention. It's about what they represent to you. They reflect something back. And that reflection doesn't feel neutral. It feels charged. Personal. Almost like it's pointing directly at something inside you that you'd rather not see. And that emotional charge, that intensity, is what drives your reaction. This is where a deeper psychological insight comes into play. What you resist in others often exists, in some form, within you, even if you don't consciously recognize it. And that idea can feel uncomfortable at first, because it shifts the focus away from blaming the outside world and brings it inward. Instead of asking, "Why did they do that?" you begin to ask, "Why did that affect me so strongly?" And that question changes everything. Because pushing something away internally doesn't remove it. It doesn't disappear. It simply moves out of your awareness. And from there, it finds other ways to show up, often through projection. You begin to notice certain traits in others. Traits that irritate you, trigger you, stay with you. And because you've separated those traits from yourself internally, they feel foreign when you see them outside. But at the same time, they feel strangely familiar. That combination, familiarity and rejection, is what creates the intensity. It's not just about what you're seeing. It's about what you're seeing reflected back. And this is where the sense of discomfort begins to make more sense. It's not a physical threat. It's a psychological one. Because when something you've rejected within yourself appears in someone else, It challenges the image you built of who you are. It disrupts the version of yourself you're trying to maintain. And naturally, your mind reacts. It tries to push that discomfort away. It tries to reassert control. It focuses on the other person, their behavior, their words, their flaws. But in doing so, it avoids looking at what's actually being revealed. And that's the trap. Because reacting in that way doesn't resolve anything. It reinforces the pattern. It keeps your attention fixed on the external world, while the internal cause remains untouched. And as long as that internal piece remains unexamined, it continues to shape your reactions, again and again, without your awareness. So the real shift isn't about controlling your reactions or suppressing them. It's about becoming curious about them. Instead of immediately judging what you feel, you begin to observe it. You notice what triggered it. You pay attention to the intensity. You watch how it unfolds. And slowly, patterns begin to emerge. You start to see that certain situations trigger similar responses. That certain traits consistently stand out to you. That certain emotional reactions repeat across different people and different moments. And once you see those patterns clearly, you can't unsee them. They begin to tell a story, not about the world, but about how you've been relating to yourself. And that awareness creates something powerful. A small distance between you and your reaction. Not enough to eliminate it. Not enough to make you perfect. But enough to stop being completely controlled by it. Enough to see that what you're feeling is not just about the present moment. It's connected to something deeper. And in that space, something begins to change. The reaction still comes, but it doesn't own you in the same way. It doesn't define the moment completely. You're not just inside it, you're also observing it. And that is where real control begins. Not by forcing yourself to feel differently, but by understanding what your feelings are revealing, and no longer letting them operate in the dark. On Stoicism Breath, there is a moment in self-awareness that feels both unsettling and deeply revealing. It's the moment when you realize that what disturbs you in others doesn't feel entirely foreign. It feels familiar. Not in a way you can easily explain, but in a way you can feel. There's a strange tension in it, a push and pull. Part of you rejects what you see, resists it, wants to distance yourself from it. But another part of you recognizes it, almost like an echo. And that combination, familiarity and rejection, is exactly what gives your reaction its intensity. This is what Carl Jung pointed to, with a kind of clarity that cuts deeper the more you sit with it. He said that what remains unconscious does not stay inactive. It continues to influence how you see, how you interpret, and how you behave quietly from the background. And if you never bring it into awareness, it will shape your life in ways you don't recognize. You'll call it coincidence. You'll call it personality. You'll call it just how things are. But in reality, it's something internal, repeating itself. And the more you begin to observe your own patterns, the harder it becomes to ignore. Because when the same types of reactions keep showing up, again and again, across different people and situations, it starts to feel like certain people just affect you more, or certain moments are just harder. But when you slow down and trace it back, something changes. You begin to see that it's not just about what's happening outside of you. It's about something inside of you that hasn't been fully seen yet. And this is where your entire perspective begins to shift. Instead of treating your reactions as direct responses to the world, you start seeing them as reflections. Not perfect reflections. Not always obvious, but reflections nonetheless. Every strong reaction carries information. It points to something within you that is still active, still influencing how you interpret everything around you. And if you ignore that signal, if you keep focusing only on the external trigger, the pattern doesn't go away. It continues. Quietly, repeatedly, predictably. Now, this realization isn't comfortable. In fact, it can feel deeply unsettling. Because it challenges something most people hold on to, the idea that what bothers them is entirely outside of them. That the problem is out there, in other people, in circumstances, in situations. But what if part of it isn't? What if some of the things you dislike most in others are connected in some way to something within you? That idea blurs the line between internal and external. It makes your judgments feel less certain, less absolute. And naturally, there's resistance. Because it's easier to point outward than to look inward. But here's the truth. That discomfort is where understanding begins. Because the moment you allow yourself to consider that possibility, something powerful happens. Your reactions stop being something that just happens to you. They become something you can learn from. Now, this doesn't mean every reaction is a projection. It doesn't mean everything you see in others exists in you in the same way. The point is not to collapse all distinctions. The point is to recognize patterns, especially when the reaction is strong, persistent, and disproportionate. Because that's where the real insight lives. That's where something internal is being activated, not created, but revealed. And when you start paying attention to this, something subtle begins to change. The reaction still happens, but it's no longer completely automatic. There is a moment, sometimes just a brief one, where you notice it. You recognize the intensity. And instead of immediately directing all your attention outward toward the other person or the situation, you turn some of that attention inward. Not in a self-critical way, but in a curious one. You begin to ask, what exactly is being triggered here? Why does this feel stronger than it should? What does this remind me of beyond this moment? And that shift changes everything. Because now, instead of being fully absorbed in the reaction, you are also observing it. And that observation creates space. Not a large space at first, but enough. Enough to interrupt the automatic pattern. Enough to see that what you're feeling isn't just about this moment. It's connected to something that has been shaping your responses for a long time. And as that awareness grows, something else begins to happen. The reactions start to lose their intensity. Not because you're suppressing them, but because you're understanding them. You're no longer treating the external trigger as the sole cause. You're recognizing the internal component, the part of the reaction that comes from your own unresolved experiences, your own patterns, your own history. And once you see that clearly, it becomes much harder to be completely controlled by it. Because now, you're not just reacting. You're aware. And this is where the idea of control begins to change. Control is no longer about trying to eliminate your reactions or forcing yourself to feel differently. It becomes about something deeper. It becomes about changing your relationship to what you feel, seeing it clearly, understanding where it comes from, and deciding how much authority it actually has over you. Because the moment you stop treating reflections as causes, you begin to take back something that was never meant to be given away. Your clarity. Your awareness. Your ability to choose. And from that place, everything begins to shift. On Stoicism Breath, there is a subtle shift that changes everything, not just how you react, but how you begin to see the people around you. At first, it's almost unnoticeable. The same people that once treated you no longer have the same effect. The same words, the same behavior, the same situation, yet something feels different. And here's the key. They didn't change. Your interpretation did. You're no longer seeing them as direct causes of your emotions. You're seeing them more clearly as reflections, as influences, but not as authorities over your internal state. And that shift, as small as it seems, is where a new kind of stability begins. But then, there's another layer. And this one is more deceptive. Because it doesn't show up as discomfort. It shows up as relief, as connection, as ease, as something that feels almost complete. You meet someone, or maybe reconnect with someone, and suddenly everything feels lighter, clearer, more grounded. Their presence seems to organize something inside you that used to feel scattered. Their attention feels meaningful, not just in a superficial way, but in a way that feels like recognition. Like, finally, someone sees you. Not just what you show on the surface, but something deeper. And because it feels so good, you don't question it. Why would you? It feels like stability. It feels like clarity. It feels like you've found something real. But if you stay with that feeling long enough, if you observe it carefully, something else begins to reveal itself. The stability you feel isn't entirely yours. It depends. It depends on their presence, their attention, their consistency. When they're there, you feel grounded. When they pull back, even slightly, something shifts. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough for you to feel it. And that's when the pattern begins to show itself. Because the more you rely on that person to maintain that feeling, the more sensitive you become to any change in them. A delayed message feels heavier. A change in tone feels more significant. A moment of distance feels unsettling. And slowly, without realizing it, you begin placing part of your internal balance in their hands. Not consciously, not intentionally, but gradually, through repeated interactions, through emotional associations, through the meaning you attach to their presence. And over time, that connection becomes something you rely on, not just to feel good, but to feel stable, to feel like yourself. And this is where it becomes important to pause and reflect. Because what feels like connection is often mixed with something else. Dependency. Not in an obvious or extreme way, but in a quiet, psychological sense. And that's why when that connection changes, or worse, disappears, it doesn't feel like a small loss. It feels disproportionate. It feels like something essential has been taken away. Because in a way, it has. Not just the person, but the version of yourself that you experience through them. The version of you that felt more confident, more certain, more complete. And when that disappears, it leaves a gap. A kind of internal emptiness that's hard to explain. You're not just missing them. You're missing how you felt when you were with them. And that distinction changes everything. Carl Jung approached this idea in a way that reframes the entire experience. He suggested that the qualities we admire most in others, the ones we feel drawn to, the ones that seem to complete us, are not just theirs. They are reflections of potential within us. Parts of ourselves that haven't been fully developed yet. And when you really sit with that idea, it becomes both empowering and uncomfortable. Because it means this. What you feel in the presence of someone else is not something they are giving you. It's something they are helping you access. They are not the source. They are the mirror. But if you haven't built that within yourself, if you haven't developed those qualities internally, then your access to that feeling remains external. It depends on them. And anything that depends on something outside of you can be taken away. Which is why the loss feels so intense. Because you're not just losing a person. You're losing access to a state of being. A state that felt like clarity, like confidence, like wholeness. And without them, it feels like that state is gone. But here's the truth. It was never gone. It was never theirs to give. It was always yours. You just accessed it through them. And once you understand that, even slightly, something begins to change. You stop placing your sense of completeness outside of yourself. You begin to reclaim it. Not all at once, not perfectly, but gradually. You start building that stability from within. Through your own awareness, your own actions, your own relationship with yourself. And as that internal foundation strengthens, something interesting happens. Your external relationships begin to feel different. Not less meaningful, but less controlling. You can still connect, still appreciate, still value people deeply. But you no longer depend on them to feel whole. You're no longer looking for someone to complete something inside you. You're engaging from a place that is already more complete. And that shift changes everything. Because now, when something external changes, when someone pulls away, when a connection evolves or ends, it doesn't create the same collapse. It may still affect you, but it doesn't take something essential away. Because what felt essential was never meant to be held outside of you in the first place. And in recognizing that, you take back something powerful. Your center. Your stability. Your sense of self. Not through force. Not through detachment. But through understanding. And from that place, a different kind of strength begins to emerge. Quiet, steady, unshakable. On Stoicism Breath, there comes a moment of quiet realization, one that doesn't arrive with noise or drama, but with clarity. It's the moment you begin to understand that what you once believed was given to you by others was never truly theirs to give. That feeling of completeness, that sense of being grounded, that version of yourself that felt more confident, more whole, more certain, it didn't come from them. It came through them. And once you see that, even slightly, you stop unconsciously placing your sense of wholeness in someone else. You begin to recognize something deeper. What feels like completion is actually a reflection of something you are capable of developing within yourself. And that realization begins to shift everything. Not instantly. Not perfectly. But enough. Enough to change how you relate to the connection. You can still appreciate someone. You can still value their presence. You can still feel the impact they have on your life. But something is different now. They no longer hold the same level of control. Because your sense of self is no longer fully tied to them. Instead, something new begins to form. You begin building stability from within. Not through external validation, but through your own actions. Through your own understanding. Through the way you relate to yourself when no one is watching. And at first, it feels subtle. Almost fragile. But over time, as you continue to return to yourself, again and again, that foundation strengthens. And as it does, your relationships begin to feel different. Not less meaningful, but less necessary for your sense of balance. You're no longer looking for someone to complete you. You're engaging from a place that is already more complete. And this shift changes everything. Because now, when something external changes, when a connection evolves, becomes distant, or even ends, it doesn't create the same collapse. You may still feel it. You may still care. But it doesn't take something essential away from you. Because what once felt essential was never meant to be held outside of you in the first place. And in recognizing that, you begin to reclaim something powerful. Not through force. Not through detachment. But through understanding. A deeper, quieter understanding. one that allows you to exist in a more stable way without constantly depending on whether others remain the same. And as this awareness deepens, a larger pattern begins to reveal itself, one that becomes difficult to ignore. On one side, there are the traits you reject, the parts of yourself you pushed away, now appearing in others and triggering strong emotional reactions. On the other side, there are the traits you admire, the qualities you haven't fully developed, now appearing in others and creating attraction, admiration, even dependency. And in both cases, the same thing is happening. Something internal is being placed outside of you. And once it's outside, you lose control over it. That's the common thread. Whether it shows up as irritation or admiration, your internal state begins to depend on something external. But even that isn't the deepest layer. Because there are moments, quiet moments, when no one is triggering you. No one is validating you. No one is challenging you. And yet, there's still a pressure, a subtle tension, a sense that you need to maintain something. Not for a specific person, but for the world. A version of yourself. The version that feels acceptable, competent, composed. The version of you that seems to function well in different environments. And that version didn't appear overnight. It was built. Gradually, quietly, shaped by what was rewarded and what was discouraged. Certain behaviors brought approval, so you repeated them. Others brought discomfort or rejection, so you adjusted them, softened them, or removed them entirely. And over time, this process created something powerful. An internal blueprint. A map of how you believe you should be. And because it works, because it leads to smoother interactions, fewer conflicts, more predictable outcomes, you begin to rely on it. At first, it feels natural. You don't question it. It just feels like you. But the more closely you identify with that version, the more you begin to depend on maintaining it. And that's where the pressure comes from. Because now, every interaction carries weight. Every reaction from others feels like feedback. Every moment becomes something to manage, to adjust, to control. Not because it needs to be, but because it feels like it does. And slowly, without realizing it, your sense of stability becomes tied, once again, to something external. Not just people, but perception, expectation, image. And that's where the real work begins. Not in changing the world. Not in controlling how others see you. But in recognizing where your sense of self has been placed. And gently bringing it back. Back to something internal. Something steady. Something that doesn't need to be constantly maintained. To be real. On Stoicism Breath, there's a point in your journey where you begin to notice something subtle, but once you see it, you can't unsee it. It's the moment you realize that the version of yourself you've been trying so hard to maintain isn't just a way of navigating the world. It has quietly become your identity. At first, it feels completely natural. You don't question it. It's just who you are, or at least, who you believe yourself to be. The composed version. The capable version. The version that knows how to behave, how to respond, how to fit. And because it works, because it helps you avoid conflict, gain approval, and move smoothly through life, you begin to rely on it more and more. But slowly something shifts. Without realizing it, you stop using that version as a strategy. And you start depending on it as a foundation. Now, it's no longer just how you present yourself. It's how you define yourself. And that changes everything. Because once your identity becomes tied to maintaining a certain image, anything that threatens that image feels personal. Not like a small disruption, but like something deeper. A comment, a reaction, a subtle shift in how someone responds to you. It shouldn't matter as much as it does. But it does. Because now, it feels like it says something about you. And this is where the fragility begins to appear. Not because you are weak. Not because the version you built is flawed. But because of how tightly you're holding on to it. When your sense of self depends on maintaining a certain image, every interaction becomes a kind of test. Every conversation carries weight. Every response from others becomes a signal you feel the need to interpret. And most of the time, it's not even about what's actually happening. It's about what it might mean. This is what Seneca was pointing to when he said that we suffer more in imagination than in reality. Because so much of this tension doesn't come from real threats. It comes from anticipated ones. From the possibility that something might disrupt the version of yourself you've worked so hard to maintain. And so, you begin to operate differently. More carefully. More cautiously. You choose your words with precision. You adjust your tone. You read the room before you speak. All of it aimed at protecting that image. At preserving that identity. And on the surface, it looks like control. Like awareness. Like emotional intelligence. But underneath, there's tension. Because the more you invest in maintaining that image, the more vulnerable you become to anything that might challenge it. Because now, your stability is tied to something that exists partly outside of you. In how others see you. In how they respond. In what they think. And anything that depends on external perception is inherently unstable. It can change without warning. It can shift for reasons that have nothing to do with you. And when it does, it affects how you see yourself. And so the cycle continues. You maintain the image to feel stable. But maintaining it makes you more sensitive to anything that might threaten it, which makes you more reactive, more attentive to external signals, more dependent on perception. And over time, this cycle reinforces itself. Quietly, consistently, until it feels normal. But there's a deeper cost, one that doesn't always show up right away. When you spend so much energy maintaining a specific version of yourself, you begin to lose connection with the parts that don't fit that image. The parts that were set aside. The parts that didn't align with what was accepted, rewarded, or expected. And those parts don't disappear. They just become distant. And over time, that distance creates something difficult to describe. A feeling that there's more to you than what you're expressing, but no clear access to it. And that's where something important begins to shift. Not through force, not through rejection of the image, but through understanding. As you begin to see this pattern clearly, the need to constantly maintain that image starts to loosen. You still function. You still engage with the world. But there's less pressure. Less need to be rigid. Less urgency to protect every aspect of how you're perceived. And in that space, something new begins to emerge. Space to respond more naturally. Space to allow different parts of yourself to exist, without immediately filtering them. Without forcing them into a specific shape. And in that space, stability begins to take root. Not because you perfected your image, but because your sense of self is no longer entirely dependent on it. It's grounded in something deeper, something less conditional, something that doesn't require constant reinforcement from the outside to feel real. And this shift doesn't mean you stop feeling. It doesn't mean you become unaffected by the world around you. But it changes something fundamental. It changes how much those external reactions define you. It reduces the power that perception has over your internal state. And over time, that changes everything. Because now, the world can move. And you don't move with it in the same way. You remain steady. Not because nothing affects you, but because what affects you no longer controls you. On Stoicism Breath, there is a shift in perspective that changes everything, not by changing the world around you, but by changing how you understand the mind that reacts to it. Because the Stoics never taught control in the way most people think. They didn't say, "Control everything outside of you." They said something far more practical and far more challenging. Understand the mind that reacts. Not in theory, but in real life. Because knowing you shouldn't be controlled by external things is one thing. Living in a way where that actually becomes true is something entirely different. And that gap, that space between understanding and application, is where most people get stuck. It's where reactions still feel automatic, still feel justified, still feel like they leave you no room to choose anything else. You know you shouldn't overreact. You know you shouldn't take things personally. But in the moment, it happens anyway. Fast, immediate, familiar. And this is exactly where Marcus Aurelius kept returning, again and again, not as philosophy, but as a daily reminder. Come back to yourself. Come back to your own mind. Especially in the moments when everything feels like it's pulling you outward. Because when something happens, something small, something unexpected, your attention moves instantly. It goes straight to the event, to the person, to what was said, to what was done, to how it felt. And in that movement, something subtle gets missed. The moment where interpretation begins. Because what happened is just an event. But almost immediately, your mind turns it into something more. It assigns meaning. Quietly, quickly, automatically. And that meaning feels inseparable from the event itself. But it's not. It's created. And once that meaning is in place, your reaction follows. Almost instantly. Not because it has to, but because it feels like the only possible response. And this is where one of the most powerful ideas comes in. The idea of space. Not physical space. Psychological space. The space between what happens and how you respond to it. Now, it's easy to talk about this space. It sounds simple. Just pause. Just think. Just choose differently. But in reality, that space is often so small, it feels like it doesn't exist at all. Especially when the reaction is strong. When something hits a sensitive point, your response can feel immediate. Almost like a reflex. And in those moments, it doesn't feel like you have a choice. It feels like you are the reaction. But here's the truth. That space is there. Even if it's small. And accessing it doesn't require dramatic effort. It requires practice. Not forcing yourself to be different, but training yourself to notice. Because your mind is used to reacting quickly. It's used to forming interpretations instantly and treating them as truth. So changing the pattern doesn't happen by simply deciding to think differently. It happens by slowing down just enough. Just enough to see what's happening before it fully takes over. And that slowing down doesn't mean hesitation. It doesn't mean weakness. It means clarity. It means giving yourself a moment to recognize something crucial. What you're experiencing is not just the event. It's your interpretation of the event. And the moment you see that, even briefly, you create possibility. The possibility to respond differently. Not perfectly. Not every time. But enough to begin shifting the pattern. And there's something else that matters here. A distinction that most people miss. The difference between observing a reaction and suppressing it. Because suppression might look like control. But it's not. It pushes the reaction down. It hides it. But it doesn't change where it comes from. It stays there, waiting, until it surfaces again, often stronger. Observation is different. Observation brings the reaction into awareness. It allows you to see it, not as something that defines you, but as something that is happening within you. And that distinction changes everything. Because when you observe a reaction, you create distance from it. You are no longer completely inside it. You are also aware of it. And over time, that awareness reduces its intensity. Not by force, but by understanding. And as this becomes more familiar, something begins to shift. The urgency of your reaction starts to fade. Not because things stop affecting you, but because the immediate need to respond softens. You begin to see that not every thought needs to be followed. Not every feeling needs to control your behavior. There is space, even if it's small, to choose. And in that space, you begin to take your power back. Quietly, gradually, consistently. Not by controlling the world, but by understanding yourself. On Stoicism Breath, something quiet begins to change the moment you stop reacting automatically and start observing instead. At first, it's almost invisible. But over time, you begin to notice something important. The urgency of your reaction starts to fade. Not because life becomes easier. Not because people suddenly behave better. Not because situations stop affecting you. But because something inside you is no longer rushing to respond the same way. That immediate impulse, the need to reply, to explain, to defend, to react instantly, begins to soften. And in its place, something new appears. Space. Even if it's small. Even if it only lasts a second. It's enough. Enough to realize something most people miss. Not every thought needs to be followed. Not every feeling needs to dictate your behavior. And that realization is powerful. Because in that small space, you begin to choose. Not perfectly. Not every time. But consistently enough to change your direction. And this is where control begins to take on a completely different meaning. It's no longer about controlling the world around you. It's no longer about making sure everything goes your way. It becomes something deeper. It becomes about understanding your own mind well enough that you're no longer carried away by it. You begin to notice when you're assigning meaning too quickly. When a small event turns into a big conclusion. When you're reacting based on patterns, not the present moment. And once you see that, something shifts. Because now, you're not just reacting. You're aware of the reaction. And that awareness changes your relationship to everything. Life doesn't suddenly become easy. People are still unpredictable. Situations still change. Emotions still come and go. But they no longer hold the same authority over you. because you stop treating your first reaction as the final truth. Instead, you begin to see it for what it really is. The first layer. Not the whole picture. Just the beginning, not the conclusion. And that shift, as subtle as it seems, creates a new kind of stability. A stability that doesn't depend on the world behaving a certain way. A stability that isn't constantly shaken by small changes outside of you. Because it's built somewhere else. Internally. Through awareness. Through practice. Through repetition. Not through control over circumstances. And over time, this way of relating to your reactions becomes more natural. The space becomes easier to access. The interpretations become easier to question. And the reactions, while still there, become less overwhelming. Not because they disappear, but because they no longer take over in the same way. And this is where real change begins. Not in eliminating what you feel, but in understanding it clearly enough that it no longer controls you. And as this understanding deepens, everything starts to settle. Not into a final answer, but into a direction. A way of being that becomes clearer the more you follow it. Because being emotionally unshakable is often misunderstood. It's not about becoming cold. It's not about becoming distant or indifferent. It's not about pretending that nothing matters. That idea might sound strong, but it misses the point. Because what actually changes is not whether you feel. It's how much authority those feelings have over you. And that difference, subtle as it is, transforms everything. At the core of it, there's a simple but difficult question. Where is your center? Not where you think it is. Not where you want it to be. But where it actually operates, in real time. Because every time your emotional state shifts based on something external, it reveals something. Your center is moved. Even if only for a moment. It has been placed somewhere outside of you. And this movement happens quietly. So quietly you rarely notice it. Because it feels normal. It feels like a natural reaction. But over time, those small shifts begin to accumulate. They form patterns. And those patterns shape how you experience yourself and the world. Which is why taking your center back is not a one-time decision. It's not something you do once and never think about again. It's a process. A repeated one. You notice when your attention drifts outward. You recognize when your state becomes dependent on something external. And you bring it back. Gently. Without force. Without judgment. Just with awareness. Again and again and again. And each time you do that, even slightly, you reclaim something. Your stability. Your clarity. Your self-direction. Not all at once, but piece by piece. And over time, that becomes your strength. Quiet, grounded, unshakable. On Stoicism Breath, there comes a moment, quiet, almost unnoticeable, when you realize your attention has drifted. Not outward in a dramatic way, but subtly, pulled by something someone said, something they didn't say, a reaction, a silence, a look. And instead of chasing it like you used to, you do something different. You bring your attention back. Not forcefully. Not with frustration. But with clarity. You recognize what's happening. You see that your reaction is tied to something external. And in that awareness, you pause. Even if it's just for a second. And that pause changes everything. Because in that small space, you create a different outcome. Not by denying what you feel. Not by pretending it doesn't matter. But by separating something most people never separate. The feeling from the conclusion. You allow the emotion to exist, fully, honestly. But you stop turning it into a story about your worth. About your identity. About who you are. And that separation, as small as it seems, is powerful. Because it prevents a simple moment from turning into something bigger than it needs to be. It stops a passing feeling from becoming a defining belief. And over time, this becomes more natural. The pause becomes easier to access. The awareness becomes faster. The reactions begin to lose their intensity. Not because you're suppressing them, but because you've stopped feeding them. You've stopped automatically interpreting every external signal as something personal. And this doesn't make you cold. It doesn't make you indifferent. You still feel everything. You still experience frustration, disappointment, discomfort. But those feelings no longer take over your entire state. They pass through you instead of taking control of you. And something else begins to change too. The way you relate to people. Their behavior still matters. But it no longer defines you. You can enjoy a compliment without depending on it. You can face criticism without collapsing under it. Because your sense of self is no longer tightly attached to how others respond to you. And from that shift, a new kind of stability begins to form. Not the loud, dramatic kind, but something quieter, stronger, more reliable. A stability that doesn't depend on the world staying consistent, but comes from understanding your own mind, from recognizing patterns, from questioning automatic interpretations, from choosing, moment by moment, how much authority you give to what happens around you. And this process is gradual. There will be moments where old patterns return. Moments where reactions happen too quickly. Moments where awareness comes too late. That's part of it. Because the goal is not perfection. It's direction. Every time you notice the pattern, every time you create even the smallest pause, Every time you question a reaction that once felt automatic, you shift something, just a little. And those small shifts begin to add up. They change how often you react automatically. They change how long those reactions last. They change how much power external events have over your internal state. Not instantly, but steadily. In a way you start to notice if you're paying attention. And eventually, something becomes clear. The stability you've been searching for was never going to come from controlling the outside world. It was always going to come from understanding how you relate to it, from recognizing where your center is, and gently bringing it back every time it moves. And once that becomes part of how you live, something profound happens. The world doesn't need to change for you to feel different, because the control you were searching for was never out there. It was always here, in how you choose to respond, moment by moment. There will always be noise. People will change. Situations will shift. But the moment you stop letting those things decide who you are, something quiet and powerful takes its place. A stability that doesn't break every time the world moves. And once you feel even a glimpse of that, you won't want to go back. If something in this message stayed with you, don't let it fade. Stay with it. Go deeper. And continue building that quiet strength, one deliberate pause at a time. Thank you for being part of Stoicism Breath.